Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see you here on this bright, beautiful Sabbath day. Today we're going to study lesson number 21. The title is What Jesus Said About the Abomination of Desolation. And as we begin, we want to ask for the Lord's blessing, as we always do. So let's bow our heads for prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for giving us life this day. Thank you for giving us the Sabbath, a day when we can just retire from all our things and just focus on you. What a blessing it is that you give us not only things, but you give us time. We ask that you'll be with us as we study your word this morning, that it will not return unto you void, but that it will accomplish the purpose for which you sent it. And we thank you for the privilege of prayer and for hearing us, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. We are on page 285 of our study notes, and we'll go through it just as we usually do. A disciplined study of Bible prophecy requires that the student be well versed in history, because prophecy basically is history written in advance. The story that we're going to study today is very sad, particularly because it deals with an end-time apostasy among those who claim to be God's people. What we will see is that what we're going to talk about is not the reflection upon a specific individual or a specific leader. There are many genuine children of God in all rank and file denominations. Yet the Bible portrays that most of those who profess to follow God, both among the leaders and among the laity, are in apostasy, some without even realizing it. Even though our series of lessons centers mostly on the New Testament, particularly on the Gospels and the book of Acts, it is necessary for us to go back to the Old Testament for the background information that will help us understand this particular study this morning. So let's go back to the Old Testament, to the experience of Israel just before the Babylonian captivity. The history of Israel in the Old Testament is one of continual apostasy against God. The nation of Israel habitually embraced the teachings and practices of the surrounding pagan nations. For this reason, God referred to the nation of Israel just before the Babylonian captivity as a harlot. In fact, this word appears no less than 23 times in Ezekiel chapter 16, besides many uses also in chapter 23 of Ezekiel, as well as in some passages of Jeremiah that you have there in parentheses. These acts of idolatrous apostasy are referred to as abominations. And there you have the references in parentheses. So idolatrous apostasy is referred to as abominations. Ezekiel 8 is known as the abominations chapter par excellence, because God cataloged the abominations that Israel, his own professed people, were committing in the city of Jerusalem. The chapter presents these abominations in escalating order of gravity, climaxing with the worst abomination that was being practiced among God's people in the holy city. The climax is in verse 16 of Ezekiel 8. So he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and there at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they were worshiping the sun toward the east. That is the act of apostasy that culminates the list, the worst of all. And we know that in Ezekiel 8, the apostasies are in escalating order because God shows Ezekiel an apostasy or an abomination, and Ezekiel thinks, wow, this is pretty bad. God says, I'm going to show you greater abominations than these. And the greatest of all was that the leaders had their backs to the temple and they were worshiping the sun toward the east. In the very next verse, verse 17, God promised to desolate Jerusalem because of her abominations. And this is where the expression abomination of desolation comes from. The abomination is worshiping the sun, and that leads to desolation. That is what is meant by the expression abomination of desolation. It's an abomination that leads to desolation. Ezekiel 16 portrays Israel as a harlot who decked herself with jewelry of gold and silver to entice the pagan nations to fornicate with her. Obviously, we're speaking not of literal fornication, we're speaking of spiritual fornication. God's people fornicating with the practices of the pagan nations. Because of her love with the pagan customs and practices of the surrounding nations, God promised that destruction would come from the four corners of the land. Now remember all of these details, because in the final application we're going to find them all over again, referring no longer to literal Israel, but to a global religious apostasy among those who claim to serve the Lord. And so God said destruction is going to come from the four corners of the land. God promised Israel that they would drink the cup of his wrath because of the abominations that they practiced, and they would drain the cup to its very dregs. Ezekiel 1 describes God coming from the north to the Jerusalem temple to perform a work of investigative judgment, with the end result of separating the faithful from the unfaithful in the holy city among those who claim to be God's people. The pagan nations are not in view here. The judgment is not of the pagan nations. The judgment is of those who profess to be God's people. It was a judgment separation only of those who profess to be the people of God. Ezekiel 9 describes this work of separation. The chapter describes how, before the desolation of the city, God placed a mark or a sign on the foreheads of those who sighed and cried because of the abominations that were being committed in the city. Yes, God had a faithful remnant in the city, and he promised to protect these sealed ones in the midst of the desolation to come. It is crucial to underline that those who were worshiping the sun are placed in contrast in the very next verses to those who have the mark on their foreheads. So one group is worshiping the sun, the other group receives the seal on the forehead. They are contrasting groups. To a great degree, the apostasy among God's people was due to the evil influence of the religious leaders. However, the people were not free of guilt because they loved to have it so. In fact, let's read Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 31. Jeremiah 5 and verse 31. The prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests rule by their own power, and my people love to have it so. So the leaders were in apostasy, they led the people astray, and the people were perfectly happy with the leadership of Israel. When the work of separation was finished, the Shekinah glory of the Jerusalem temple departed from the sanctuary and lingered on the Mount of Olives. This is important. Remember all these details. We're going to come back to them again. After the judgment is over, in chapters 10 and 11, the Shekinah left the temple and for a while lingered on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem. And then after lingering, it departed to heaven. Without the Shekinah in the temple, the city had no protection against the invading Babylonians who were about to bring desolation. The word desolation is used repeatedly to describe what happened to Jerusalem when the presence of God abandoned it. And you can find all of the references there in parentheses, plus many more that I did not include. The desolation was terrible. Jeremiah wrote a funeral dirge, the book of Lamentations, for the people to sing as they were being led captive to Babylon. The entire book describes the horrendous famine, disease, treason, and crime that existed in Jerusalem as the armies of Babylon besieged it. It is of critical significance to realize that Jeremiah blamed the desolation of the city on the desecration of the Sabbath. Listen carefully now. What were most people doing in the city? Worshiping the sun. And Jeremiah is going to tell us that the main reason why the city was destroyed is because they were breaking the Sabbath. Notice Jeremiah 17, verses 24 and 25, and then verse 27. And it shall be, if you heed me carefully, says the Lord, to bring no burden through the gates of this city on the Sabbath day, but hallow the Sabbath day, to do no work in it, then shall enter the gates of this city kings and princes, sitting on the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their princes accompanied by the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and this city shall remain forever. What was the condition for the city to remain forever? If they kept the Sabbath day and hallowed the Sabbath day. But what if they didn't? Notice verse 27. But if you will not heed me to hallow the Sabbath day, then I will kindle a fire in its gates, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched. What was the main reason for the desolation of Jerusalem? The trampling on the holy Sabbath. The prophet Ezekiel, shortly after the ministry of Jeremiah, emphasized the extreme importance of the Sabbath as the sign between God and His people. In Ezekiel 20, verse 12, and also verse 20, we're told that the Sabbath was a sign between God and Israel to remind them that He was the only true God. It says there, moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between them and me, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. And verse 20 says, hallow my Sabbaths. That means keep the Sabbaths holy. And they will be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. So the Sabbath was the sign that distinguished Israel from the surrounding nations. It was the mark of distinction, if you please, between Israel and the pagan nations. The pagan nations worshiped the sun. God's people kept the Sabbath in honor of the Creator. In between these two verses, in between Ezekiel 20, verse 12 and verse 20, and we don't have time to read it, you're going to find that constantly God tells them, you disregarded the Sabbath. In spite of God's admonition to the people through Ezekiel, they continued trampling upon God's holy Sabbath. And finally, the Babylonian armies came to Jerusalem, destroyed the temple and the city as Ezekiel had promised. This, however, did not mark the end of Israel's history. By the way, when the destruction came, was everybody in the city killed? Who only was spared when the desolation came? Only those who observed God's holy Sabbath, who sighed and cried because the sun god was being worshipped. Is that clear? Critically important. However, this destruction of Jerusalem is not the end of Israel's history. At the end of Jeremiah's 70-year prophecy, they went to Babylon captive for 70 years. Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes gave decrees to rebuild and restore Jerusalem's temple, city, walls, and civil and religious order. God gave Israel another opportunity to redeem their past failures. So after the 70 years, they go back, they rebuild the temple, they rebuild the walls, they rebuild the city, and they reestablish their civil order and their religious order. God says, I'm going to give you another chance. The prophecy of Daniel 9, 25 to 27, foretold that after the rebuilding and restoration of Jerusalem, the city would be destroyed again. Are you catching the picture? After the captivity, everything was restored. But God said in Daniel 9 that after the 490 years, after the 70 weeks, the city of Jerusalem was going to be destroyed again. That's important. Notably, the second destruction of the city is described with the words abomination and desolation. My, how interesting. Words that we found in connection with the first destruction of Jerusalem. After the Babylonian captivity, the Israelites went back to their land and rebuilt the temple, the city, the walls, and restored their civil and religious order. The glory of the second temple was not even a shadow of the glory of the temple that Solomon built. Yet strangely, this is really strange. Yet strangely, God foretold in Haggai that this second temple would be more glorious than the first. In other words, the rebuilt temple after the captivity was going to be more glorious than the temple built by Solomon. The Jews to this day are still trying to explain how this prophecy was ever fulfilled. The Romans destroyed the second temple in the year 70 AD. And even after Herod's 46-year remodeling project of the temple, it never came close to reaching the glory of the temple built by Solomon. Did Haggai's prophecy fail? Absolutely not. The second temple was more glorious than the first because Jesus in person walked and talked in its courts. John 1 verse 14 employs two technical terms to describe the coming of Jesus. It says there that Jesus tabernacled. That's a good translation. He tabernacled, or he dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. Jesus was the Shekinah that came and ministered in this second temple. Both of these are sanctuary concepts. Sadly, however, Jesus came to his own, and his own received him not. Once again, Israel had fallen into open apostasy. Most of their guilt was at the door of whom? The religious leaders of the nation, the priests, the scribes, and the elders. And you know, Ellen White has a statement in Desire of Ages where she says that if the religious leaders had not interposed, the world would have seen the greatest revival in its history as a result of Jesus being present with the Jewish nation. But the leaders actually led the people to reject Jesus Christ. Of course, that's not going to happen at the end. The greatest conflicts of Jesus with the religious leaders, now notice this, the greatest conflict of Jesus with the religious leaders involved what? The Sabbath. Jesus had the greatest controversies with the religious leaders over the issue of the Sabbath. Now listen up. The religious leaders had created a counterfeit Sabbath. Remember we studied this? Was the Sabbath of the Jews the Sabbath of the Lord? No. They had created a Sabbath, a counterfeit Sabbath based on human tradition. They kept the right day, but in the wrong way. They strictly enforced their Sabbath while they rejected the Lord of the Sabbath. They enforced their own stringent Sabbath laws, but did not experience true Sabbath rest in Christ. For this reason, Jesus invited all to come to him to receive rest. Just as the religious leaders rejected the witness of Jeremiah and other messengers before the first destruction of Jerusalem, the leaders opposed Christ at every step of the way until there was no remedy. And by the way, because the religious leaders assumed that Jesus was breaking their Sabbath, they laid plans to kill him. Is that going to happen again? Yes. As Jesus approached Jerusalem from the east, he announced the destruction of the city. This is in Luke 19, 41 to 44, where you read it yesterday. Why was the city going to be destroyed? Because she did not know the hour of her visitation. He then entered the temple and cast out the money changers. At this point, Jesus referred to the temple as what? As the temple of God. And he referred to it as my house. For several days, Jesus then proceeded to make a final call to the leaders to receive him as the Messiah, and he did this in the confines of the temple. However, his invitation fell on deaf ears. Significantly, Jesus used many of the very words of 2 Chronicles 36, 15 to 17, where we find a description of the repeated warnings that God sent to Israel before the captivity. And now notice, as Jesus left the temple for the last time, the Shekinah now is going to what? The Shekinah is going to leave the second temple. He pronounced the chilling words, "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate." The Shekinah left the temple. The living Shekinah left the temple, and it was no longer his house or the temple of God. The desolation of the city and the temple was to follow. Are you starting to catch an interesting picture here? This is a repetition of what happened with the first destruction of Jerusalem. Upon leaving the temple for the last time, Jesus went and sat on the Mount of Olives, where he what? Interesting. The Old Testament, the Shekinah left the temple, went to the Mount of Olives, and lingered. So Jesus lingered for a while with his disciples, where he told them that Jerusalem would be desolated and the temple would be destroyed. The Shekinah glory in person had left the temple for the last time, and Jerusalem had no protection against her enemies. Some 40 years later, the Romans came against the city and did what the Babylonians had done some 600 years before. Once again, apostasy led to the ruin of Jerusalem, and there was a decree. There was no decree, by the way, you need to put the word "no" there. There was no decree to rebuild the city once more. The Hebrew theocracy had come to an end forever. See, after the first destruction, was there a prophecy that said that the city was going to be rebuilt and God is going to give them another chance? Yes. Is there anything like that after the destruction of the second temple? There's no time prophecy saying that it is going to be rebuilt. So this idea of the evangelicals today, that the Old Testament prophecies say that Jerusalem is going to be the center of end-time events, and a third temple is going to be built, and Jesus is going to be there with the Jews and so on. That is a counterfeit prophecy. That is false prophecy that is being panned off as true prophecy. Now let us turn to the profound words of Jesus in Matthew 24 and verse 15. Before we go there, however, let's get a little historical context. The first 14 verses of Matthew 24 describe in vivid detail what took place between the ascension of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem. So these verses actually describe a period of 39 years. Space won't allow us to detail everything that happened within and without the city. You know, you can get the study notes for the Matthew 24 series. I have an entire chapter there on how these verses were fulfilled leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, and how these will be global at the end of time in the second application. There were wars and rumors of wars. False messiahs and false Christs arose. There were several significant earthquakes. And when the Roman legions besieged Jerusalem, there was pestilence and famine in the city. See, that's Matthew 24. There will be earthquakes and pestilence, wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. All that was fulfilled locally surrounding Jerusalem, leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem there in the year 70. Parents and children betrayed each other for food. Christians were betrayed by their own families to the Jewish authorities. The apostles preached the gospel with power, as we find in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 14, where it says, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in his work Wars of the Jews, documents the calamities that befell Jerusalem as it was being besieged by the Romans. It is no coincidence that Josephus tells us that the book of Lamentations was again mourned by the Jews as they were being slaughtered and led away captive to all nations. So once again, Lamentations was sung in the second destruction of Jerusalem. Rome was considered New Babylon because it did to Jerusalem what the ancient Babylonians had done in the past. Now notice the cryptic words of Jesus in Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16. He said, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, does that ring a bell? Abomination, desolation. Does it have any connection with the first destruction? Absolutely. When you see, it's something that they could see, the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea do what? Flee to the mountains. What was the sign to flee? The abomination of desolation. What was the greatest abomination in the leading up to the first destruction of Jerusalem? What was the greatest abomination? It was worshiping what? The sun. What was the contrast of the others who were faithful within the city? They had the mark where? On their foreheads. They were Sabbath keepers, according to what we read. Now, what did Jesus mean by the expression abomination of desolation? We don't have to guess. Because the parallel verse in Luke 21 and verse 20 tells us what the abomination of desolation was in the first destruction of Jerusalem. Notice Luke chapter 21 and verse 20. See, in Matthew it says, when you see the abomination of desolation, flee. But here in Luke 21 it says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. So what is the abomination of desolation? It's when the city was surrounded by what? It was surrounded by the Romans, which were referred to as New Babylon. Now, why would the surrounding of Jerusalem by the Roman legions lead to its desolation? Well, let's take a look at this. As we compare Matthew 24:15 with Luke 21 verse 20, by the way, if you read verse 21 of Luke 21, it immediately says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near, then let those who are in Judea flee. So we know it's the same teaching. As we compare Matthew 24:15 and Luke 21 verse 20, we see that the abomination precedes the desolation. In other words, the abomination led to desolation. Jesus was referring to the besieging of Jerusalem by the Roman legions. But what was this abomination that led to desolation? We find the answer to this question in the contents of the standards of the Roman legions. You see, every division of the Roman legions had a standard, and that standard had certain insignia and inscriptions on it. Josephus tells us that whenever the Roman legions surrounded a city, they placed their standards in the ground and they rendered them worship. And the standards, of course, represented the sun god Mithra, the patron god of the Roman legions. Notice what Josephus wrote in Wars of the Jews. Then came the ensigns encompassing the eagle, which is at the head of the Roman legion, the king and the strongest of all birds, which seems to them a signal of dominion, and an omen that they shall conquer all against whom they march. These sacred ensigns are followed by the trumpeters. So notice the interesting detail here. The Roman legions had an eagle, and it was a signal of dominion and an omen that they would conquer all against those whom they marched. The book, The Great Controversy, adds some very important information. This is what it says. When the idolatrous standards, what kind of standards were they? Why were they idolatrous? Because the Roman legions rendered them what? Worship. When the idolatrous standards of the Romans should be set up in the holy ground, which extended some furlongs outside the city walls. See, not only was the city holy, but there was an area outside the walls that was also considered holy. So when the idolatrous standards of the Romans should be set up in the holy ground, which extended some furlongs outside the city walls, then the followers of Christ were to find what? Safety in flight. When the warning sign should be seen, those who would escape must make no delay. So, when the Christians in the city saw the city surrounded by the Roman legions, and they saw the Roman legions kneel and render worship to the sun god Mithra, who had been adopted as the patron god of the legions by Pompey in the year 63 BC, they were supposed to do what? They were supposed to flee because they saw the sign. Pictures of the Roman standards have been found in archaeological digs and historical records. Now listen to the details of what was on the standard. At the center of the standard is an eagle with outstretched wings. In its talons, the eagle has arrows. And surrounding the eagle is a golden wreath, a symbol of the sun god Mithra, the official god of the Roman legions. In worshiping the standards, the legions were really worshiping the sun god. This was the abomination and sign of the imminent destruction of Jerusalem. But now we need to ask a question. How could God's people flee the city if the city was surrounded by the Roman legions? Is that a fair question? When you see these Romans bow down and worship their sun standards in honor of the sun god Mithra, flee. How could they flee if the city was surrounded? Here comes something very interesting. The answer is again provided by Josephus. For some humanly unexplained reason, when Cestius Gallus, who was the general in the year 66 when the Roman legions first came, was at the point of taking the city, everything looked like the city was going to fall. He mysteriously retreated. The apostate Jews who had rejected the words of Jesus went after Cestius and his legions, thinking that God was with them and he was going to spare the city, like the false prophets in Jerusalem had said. And the Roman legions lost many of the soldiers when the Jews went after them. At this point, the followers of Jesus left the city. They had seen the signal and they fled. What is it that scared Cestius to leave when everything looked like it was going to conquer the city? Somehow God caused a panic. So that his people could what? So that his people, having seen the sign, could flee from the city. In the year 70 A.D., Titus returned to Jerusalem with the Roman legions and crucified more than 1 million Jews and leveled the city and the temple. However, those who paid heed to the warning of Jesus fled to the mountains and their lives were spared. Ellen White states that not one Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. Were they protected like in the Old Testament, those who sighed and cried? Absolutely. One final important point. You know, evangelists read that verse, pray that your flight not be in winter or on the Sabbath day. And they say that means that 40 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, or after Christ came to this earth, the Sabbath was still being kept. 40 years after Jesus ascended to heaven, the Sabbath was still being kept, because Jesus said to his followers, when that time comes, when the city is destroyed, pray that your flight from the city before it's destroyed is not in winter on the Sabbath day. But now, in the context that we've been studying, this is very significant because it tells us that the faithful in the city were keeping the Sabbath. Are you understanding the importance of the context? Those who were spared were what? Were Sabbath keepers. Now let's notice the final fulfillment of this story. On the Mount of Olives, the disciples had asked Jesus when the destruction of Jerusalem would take place. But they also asked another question. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So they asked two questions. When will these things be? When will the temple be destroyed in the city? And what sign will be of the end of the age and the destruction of the world? The disciples believed that the destruction of the temple and the coming of the Messiah would coincide. However, Jesus explained that what happened leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem foreshadowed what would happen shortly before his second coming. In other words, there's two fulfillments to the prophecy of Matthew 24. A partial fulfillment with the literal Jews, literal Jerusalem, and a fuller fulfillment, global fulfillment with spiritual Jews and spiritual Jerusalem. Let's take a few moments to examine the end-time fulfillment of Matthew 24, verse 15. We must remember that the final fulfillment of this prophecy will not be with literal Israel in the Middle East, but with spiritual Israel on a worldwide scale. We've already studied this principle. The final fulfillment has nothing to do with the literal Jews in literal Israel in literal Jerusalem. The book of Revelation picks up on what we studied from Ezekiel, describing a harlot. Does Revelation chapter 17 speak of a harlot? Yes. Is she decked with gold and silver and precious stones? Yes. Does she fornicate with the kings of the earth? Yes. Is she seated upon 7 hills and have children who do her bidding because she is described as her mother? Yes. Is there a cup in her hand with which she gives wine of abominations to the nations? Yes. Does Revelation 17 say that the harlot is going to be made desolate and is going to be destroyed? Yes. One cannot miss that this terminology is strikingly similar to the description that we studied from the book of Ezekiel. This must mean that the harlot of Revelation 17 does not represent a pagan nation, but it must represent an apostate what? Christian church. When God said that Israel was a harlot, was he referring to some pagan nation somewhere? No. He was saying that his own people had become a harlot. So in the end time, this harlot must represent apostate Christianity. Now, before the harlot is destroyed and made desolate because of her abominations, God will seal his faithful children on the forehead to separate them from those who have the mark of the beast and will be destroyed. Have you ever read Revelation 7 where it says that before the destruction there's going to be a mark placed on the forehead, a sign on the forehead of those who sigh and cry because of the abominations? This sealing reminds us of the sealing that took place when the religious leaders in Jerusalem were worshiping the sun just before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in the days of Ezekiel. As in the time of Ezekiel, the final destruction will come from where? From the four corners of the earth. There's four angels holding the winds, right? In the book of Revelation. God will send a message. According to this, God will send a message calling the world to worship whom? The Creator. Revelation 14 verse 7. And of course, the sign of the Creator is what? The Sabbath. God's end-time people will be Sabbath keepers. The question is, who is in contrast to Sabbath keepers in spiritual Jerusalem? In both destructions of Jerusalem, the apostates are identified as sun worshipers. Will Christians in the end time be worshiping the literal sun? No. The devil's not dumb enough to try and convince Christians to bow before the sun. They know that this would be idolatry. So what does the abomination of desolation mean in the end time? Just a little history first. It is well documented that there is a direct connection between ancient Rome, papal Rome, and the United States. Ancient Rome worshipped the literal sun god Mithra, and Roman Catholicism adopted the day which honored the sun god, that is Sunday. And Protestants have embraced Sunday as a day of worship from Roman Catholicism. There's a direct connection between ancient Rome, papal Rome, and apostate Protestantism, and it has to do with the day of worship. The founding fathers of the United States were fascinated by the government and insignia of ancient Rome. As we examine the Great Seal of the United States, by the way, both sides are found on the $1 bill if you want to check this out, we immediately detect that the founding fathers were fascinated by ancient Rome. First of all the inscriptions on the Great Seal are in Latin in a country that spoke English. The date of the Declaration of Independence at the base of the pyramid is in Roman numerals. The bald eagle with the sunburst above its head is there. The eagle has arrows in its talons. Its wings are outspread. On the obverse side, or the other side of the Great Seal, there is an unfinished pyramid with an eye above it and sun rays bursting forth from the eye. It can be proved historically that the United States adopted its insignia directly from ancient Rome. The architecture in downtown Washington, D.C. is Roman. The streets are filled with monuments that honor national heroes and commemorate historical events such as ancient Rome. In fact, for a time in early constitutional history of our country, the armies were called legions. In fact, many of the flags of our early legions had an eagle with sunbursts above its head or irradiating from its body. The name of the upper chamber of Congress is the Senate, and there senators serve. Where does that language come from? It comes from ancient Rome. Space won't allow me to provide all of the documentation, but historians tell us that the connection between ancient Rome and the United States is undeniable. Notice this one statement that I included. The neoclassical spirit of America at the end of the 18th century looked to the ancient Roman Republic for many symbols, including the name of the upper chamber of Congress, the Senate. In Rome, the eagle began as a republican symbol. I'm not talking about the Republican Party. It's a republic. As a republican symbol. Hence, that is for this reason, Americans chose their native bald eagle for the national arms in 1782. When Protestants broke away from the Roman Catholic Church in the 16th century, they were not able to discard Sunday observance that Roman Catholicism had adopted from the ancient Roman Republic. Thus, they pay homage to Rome, no matter how much they try to deny it. Let me give you an example. John O'Brien, a long-tenured theology professor of the University of Notre Dame and the author of some 40 books, wrote this very interesting statement. But since Saturday, not Sunday, is specified in the Bible, isn't it curious that non-Catholics who profess to take their religion directly from the Bible and not from the church observe Sunday instead of Saturday? Yes, of course, it is inconsistent. But this change was made about 15 centuries before Protestantism was born. And by that time, the custom was universally observed. They, that is, Protestants, have continued the custom, even though it rests upon the authority of what? Of the Catholic Church, and not upon an explicit text in the Bible. And now comes the key portion of the statement. That observance remains as a reminder of the Mother Church. So are the Protestant denominations the daughters? Yes. Once again, that observance remains as a reminder of the Mother Church, from which the non-Catholic sects broke away. Like a boy running away from home, but still carrying in his pocket a picture of his mother or a lock of her hair. Why are the daughters going to return to the mother? Why are they in the process of returning to the mother? Because they have many of the doctrines in common. And what is the most salient doctrine? It is the idea that Sunday, the day of the sun, inherited from the Romans in the days of Constantine, is the day of worship that we are supposed to keep. The Protestant churches, as corporate entities, are the daughters of the harlot, because they have obtained their day of worship, and doctrines such as the immortality of the soul and an eternally burning hell, they have adopted these from her. The sign or signal of God is the Sabbath. This being the case, the mark of the beast must be what? An opposite day of worship, the day of the sun, Sunday. But now notice, some might object that it is not the same to worship the sun as it is to worship on the day of the sun. At first sight, it might appear that it isn't the same to worship the sun as to worship on the day of the sun. However, upon closer inspection, it is very, very much the same. I frequently ask people, who made the sun? The answer is always God. Then I ask a second question. Did God make the sun for worship? The immediate answer is, of course not. I then ask a third question. What happens if you make the sun an object of worship? What would you call that? The answer is immediate. Well, that would be idolatry. I then ask, why would it be idolatry? The answer comes back, because the sun is not a sacred object. It is a secular object that God did not make for worship. Then I ask another series of questions. Who made the first day of the week? The answer comes back, God did. My next question is, did He make the first day of the week as a day of worship? The answer is clear. Of course what? Of course not. And then, because it's one of the secular days of work, then I ask a third question. And what happens if we make the first day of the week a day of worship when God did not make it a day of worship? Then there's usually a deep silence. And the answer comes belatedly and softly, why, that would be idolatry. But then I ask, why would it be idolatry? Simply because you have made a day of worship out of the day which God meant for secular purposes. Incidentally, Sunday cannot be holy because it is impossible for man to make anything holy. Only God can make days and things holy. Thus, the wrong way among the Jews and the wrong day among the Christians are both based on human tradition rather than the Word of God. Is it the same principle? It is the same principle, folks. The day is coming very soon when the Christian world, led by the United States, will impose by force of law Sunday as a day of worship, the law will be sealed with the Great Seal of the United States, which contains the same elements of the Roman standard. Listen to this statement from the history of the United States flag. The Great Seal, or state of arms, is the official emblem of the United States. Now let me stop there for a moment. Is the Sunday law going to be a law that is written and approved by Congress? Yes, because Congress actually writes the laws, right? And the president enforces the law, and the Supreme Court interprets the law. So is Congress going to propose and actually enact a national Sunday law, honoring the day of the sun? Absolutely. Now, let me ask you, would that be unconstitutional? Yes. Of course it would be. Do you think there are going to be people that are going to contest that law? Yes. They're going to contest the law. And where is it going to end up finally? At the Supreme Court. In other words, you know that when a law is contested, a law that Congress writes is contested, immediately people appeal to where? To the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will evaluate the arguments that are given that this is an infringement of the First Amendment to the Constitution, because Congress can make no law that establishes religion or forbidding the free exercise thereof. But here's the sad thing. The sad thing is that the Supreme Court, the last court of appeal, is going to declare that the law is constitutional. That's why the book of Revelation says that this beast from the earth, which represents the United States, has two horns like a lamb, which are the first two clauses of the First Amendment. It has two horns like a lamb, but it contradicts what that represents, because it speaks like what? It speaks like a dragon. So it says the Great Seal, or state of arms, is the official emblem of the United States. All judicial, legislative, and executive, are these the three branches of the government? Yes. Proclamations bear this seal. It certifies and authenticates all official acts of the federal government. It must appear on all its authoritative laws and statutes. Is the Sunday law going to have that? Going to have the Great Seal on it? Yes, it is. Now, you might think that this is a preposterous idea. If you don't believe it now, you will believe it later when you see it with your own eyes. God is seeking a people today who will sigh and cry because of the abominations that are being practiced among those who profess to be Christians. Divorce, gay marriage, gay clergy, support for transgender lifestyles, and a deafening silence about the crime of abortion are leavening the church and leading it into an irreversible apostasy. See, it doesn't begin with a Sunday law. It begins with many other things that the church keeps silent about and says, well, you know, we need to go along with culture. There must be a sighing and crying because of the abominations that are being committed where? In the church. In Revelation 18, verses 1 through 5, this sighing and crying is described. What is the equivalent to the sighing and crying in Jerusalem? It is the loud cry of Revelation chapter 18. Let's read that quickly. Revelation chapter 18. This is an indictment of the Christian world, folks. What I'm going to read now is a message not for the world in general, although they will also have to make the decision. It is an indictment upon apostate Christianity. Notice verse 1. After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried how? Mightily. And in case you didn't understand mightily, it says with a loud voice. That's why it's called the loud cry. Is that the sighing and crying? Yes. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, is fallen. What is Babylon? It's the apostate church. And has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison of every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxuries. Here you have a collusion of the political powers of the world with the religious powers of the world, and even with the business people of the world. Verse 4, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, now listen carefully, come out of her, my people. So the sighing and crying, does it have anything to do with God's people? Yes. Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins and lest you receive her plagues. So in the Old Testament, they were sighing and crying for people in the city to listen to the message and to be spared. But most of them did not listen to the message. So in Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, the sighing and crying is described where God calls his faithful people out of the apostate religious world described as Babylon. And of course, our mission is to tell people, will you accept the call of Jesus to come forth? The decision, of course, is in the mind of every single person in the world to make the decision whether they are going to practice the abominations of the world and consent to them, or whether they are going to sigh and cry because of the abominations that the church has turned a blind eye to. Did you understand what we studied today? Yes. You see, the abomination of desolation clearly at the end of time is not only worship on the day of the sun, claiming that the day of the sun is a holy day, but it includes other abominations as well, such as the ones that I mentioned, the issue of gay marriage, transgender lifestyles. Now, let me tell you, we need to love people who are practicing those things, but we don't love what they do. And we have to speak up about what God's plan is. So let's share this message so that people can be on God's side and not on the devil's side.